The grass in that north pasture still comes up thin over the fence corner, even now, 60 years on. I've noticed that every April when I walk out here, with my cane catching in the gopher holes, past caring much whether I twist an ankle doing it. There's a granite marker sunk in the ground about knee-high, plain as a headstone, and some mornings I'll stand at that rail for the better part of an hour before my coffee goes cold in the truck. My grandson asks why I bother. I tell him some ground remembers what happened to it, and if you stand still enough, it'll tell you. I was 17 years old on the Tuesday morning I buried my uncle, and the wind that day came down out of the sandhills so hard and dry, it peeled the black crepe right off the church door before the service even started. That was the 8th of March, 1962. The ground was still half frozen, and the men from the funeral home in Valentine had to bring a pick before the gravediggers could get through the top 18 inches. I remember standing at the edge of that hole in my one good coat, watching the clods come up gray and hard as brick, thinking that a man who had spent his whole life softening ground for something to grow in was going into it harder than he'd ever left it. He was the last of my people. My mother's older brother, a bachelor, no children of his own, and by the time the county lawyer read out the will in his cramped little office above the hardware store, there wasn't a soul left standing between me and 340 acres of Cherry County grazing land, 60 head of cattle, a house with a roof that leaked over the kitchen, and a note at the Valentine State Bank for $2,400 that nobody expected a boy to pay. I didn't feel like an heir. I felt like a kid who'd been handed a shovel and told to keep digging a hole that had already swallowed everybody he loved. But there was one animal on that place who seemed to think different, or at least seemed to think something, which was more than most folks credited him for. An old Hereford bull named Duke, my uncle's favorite, going on 9 years old that spring, and already thick through the shoulders, with the kind of age that makes a man start pricing him by the pound instead of the season. Duke had never given anybody trouble in his life. He grazed where he was told, bred when he was needed, and minded his own business, same as any decent bull ought to. Which is exactly why it was so strange, that first week after the funeral, to find him standing in the same corner of the north pasture, morning after morning, pawing at the same 6 feet of frozen ground, like there was something If you enjoy stories like this, I've put together a special collection called The Land They Laughed At. 15 original farm and homestead stories you won't find on this channel. You can read them or listen to the complete audiobook ad-free, with no interruptions. The link is in the description and pinned comment. Under it he meant to get to, before the both of us ran out of time. I didn't have time to study on Duke that week, though. I had the Valentine State Bank to see about, on a Thursday morning, the 22nd of March, with frost still thick on the truck windshield, and a scraper that didn't do the job right. The bank sat on Main Street, with brick the color of a scab, and a clock in the window that ran 4 minutes slow, and I remember thinking that clock and I had something in common, both of us a little behind where we ought to be. The man behind the desk was named Delbert Aldous, loan officer, a fellow my uncle used to call cautious as a hen in a hailstorm, and he had my uncle's file open in front of him like it was a body he was fixing to examine. $2,400 outstanding on the note, he said, like I didn't know the number better than my own age. He asked how old I was. I told him 17, going on 18 in June. He wrote that down like it settled something. Ranching's not a boy's trade, he said. Not cruel about it, just certain, the way men get certain about things they've never had to be wrong about. He talked about liquidating the herd, about a fair price for the land from somebody established, somebody who could carry the paper without the bank losing sleep. I told him I intended to keep the place running. He looked at me the way you look at a calf that's wandered onto the highway, not angry, just waiting for somebody else to come move it. I left with the note still standing, and no promises made either way, and drove 12 miles to the Grange Hall that evening, because my uncle had never missed a Thursday supper there in the 11 years since I'd come to live with him, and I figured somebody ought to keep the seat warm. I wish I hadn't. Ronnie Spear and two of the Hutchins boys were laid up against the coffee urn taking bets, plain as auction day, on how long before the coal place changed hands. Ronnie had me pegged at 90 days. One of the Hutchins boys, the younger one, gave me till first snow, which I took as a kindness, comparatively. Nobody said it cruel. That's the part that took me longest to understand, years later, turning it over like a stone in my pocket. They didn't hate me, any of them. They just didn't think a boy could hold 340 acres together with baling wire and stubbornness. And by their lights they'd seen enough boys fail to know the odds. I drove home in the dark, with the heater rattling and the radio, catching nothing but static past Kilgore. And when I pulled up the lane past midnight, there was Duke, a pale shape against the fence line even in that little moonlight, still standing in that same north corner, like he'd been waiting on me to come see for myself. I cut the engine and sat there a minute, letting the truck tick and cool, watching him. He didn't move for me the way he moved for feed or water. He just stood, head low, working that one patch of dirt with his near front hoof, like a man scraping mud off a boot. Over and over, same 6 inches of ground. I should tell you what the place actually was, before I go further, because the size of it matters to what came after. 340 acres, deeded whole, though I wouldn't understand for months how much of that number was fiction. 60 head of cattle, give or take what the coyotes and the hard winter had taken. A barn my uncle always meant to re-shingle, leaning 2 degrees west of Plum. The kind of lean you learn to read like a barometer. Worse after rain, better in a dry spell, never fixed either way. A hand pump by the kitchen door that spit rust the first 30 seconds every morning. And Duke. Duke was 11 years old that spring. Ancient for a working bull. A big blocky Hereford with a face like a dropped anvil, and a disposition my uncle used to call opinionated, same as his owner. My uncle had paid $410 for him as a yearling back in '52, off a breeder outside Ainsworth, and he'd never once regretted it out loud, though he complained about him plenty. Duke had sired most of the herd twice over. He was slow now, stove up in the hips, and by any sensible accounting past his usefulness. But my uncle kept him anyway, fed him the good hay in winter, and I never asked why, because you don't ask a man why he keeps what he loves. What I did know, because I'd helped him do it, was that he'd restrung that north corner of fence twice in the year before he died, once in April, once again that October, tearing out perfectly good wire both times to do it. I remembered holding the stretcher while he swore at a post that wouldn't sit straight, remembered him standing back afterward, with his hands on his hips, just staring at that corner, the way a man stares at a crossword he can't finish. I'd asked him once what was wrong with it. He'd said, "Nothing's wrong with it, Wyatt," in a voice that told me plenty was. I hadn't thought about that in weeks, not with the funeral and the bank, and Ronnie Spear's 90-day wager sitting in my gut like a swallowed stone. But standing in that yard past midnight, watching Duke paw the same 6 inches of frozen ground my uncle had fussed over twice in his last year of living, something in me went quiet and careful, the way it does right before you understand you've been looking at something the whole time without seeing it. I want to tell you it stopped there. That one night of watching was enough to send me out with a shovel, and my mind made up. It wasn't. Morning came, and Duke was back at it before I'd even finished the milking, pawing that same patch of frozen clay with his front hoof, throwing up little brown chunks of earth that steamed in the cold. I hazed him off toward the tank 3 separate times that week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and 3 separate times I'd come back an hour later to find him standing in that same corner again, head down, working the ground like it owed him something. He wasn't eating right. A bull that size ought to put away better than 60 pounds of hay a day, and he was leaving half of it in the rack, going back out to that fence line instead, rain or not, wind or not. By the second week of it, I wasn't the only one who'd noticed. I made the mistake of saying something about it at the feed store in town, standing at the counter while Orrin Meeks weighed out a sack of cottonseed cake. And Dale Whitlock's boy, Curtis, a year ahead of me in school, driving his daddy's truck like he owned the road it was on, happened to be leaning against the counter waiting on his own order. "Your uncle's old bull gone soft in the head?" he said, not even looking up from the ball cap he was turning over in his hands. "Heard he's out there digging holes, instead of servicing cows. That's about the surest sign there is, Wyatt. Animal gets like that. Best thing for him and for you is the sale barn in Valentine before he hurts somebody." A couple of the older men by the stove chuckled, not unkindly, the way men chuckle at something they've seen before and expect to see again. One of them, Harlan Spear's uncle, I think, said something about a horse he'd had once that went the same way, walked in circles till the day they put him down. I didn't say much back. I paid for my cake and my wire, and I drove home with my jaw tight, telling myself Curtis Whitlock didn't know Duke from a fence post, that he'd never once helped his father string wire, or pull a calf, or sit up with a sick animal past midnight the way I had. But driving those 4 miles back, with the heater ticking and the fields gone gray under a sky that couldn't decide on snow, I kept turning it over anyway, the wager Ronnie Spear had going, the 90 days already burning down, and now a bull that wouldn't graze, and a boy the whole county figured was too green to know the difference between a sick animal and a stubborn one. I made up my mind that night I'd find out for myself which one Duke was. I went looking that night, not in the pasture, where the ground was already froze too hard for a boy with a shovel to do anything but bruise his hands, but in the tack room, where my uncle kept things he didn't figure anyone else needed to see. I'd been in there plenty of times for a halter or a hoof pick, but I'd never gone through the shelf above the bridles, the one with the coffee cans of nails and the mouse-chewed feed receipts going back to '54. It was there, behind a can of harness rivets, that I found his notebook, the leather gone soft and dark with handling, the kind you buy at the co-op for $1.10 and fill up over years without ever meaning to. Most of it was ordinary. Breeding dates, a column of figures for hay put up in 58, 59, 60. A page about a vet bill for a heifer that scoured bad in the spring of '57 and didn't make it. I sat on an overturned bucket with the barn lamp hissing and read through a decade of my uncle's handwriting, getting smaller and more hurried the closer it got to the last pages, like he'd started rationing the paper, or rationing something else. Then, near the back, the entries changed. No more breeding dates, just fragments, dated but half-finished, like a man writing to himself in the middle of the night and not caring if it made sense to anyone who came after. February 14th, wrote Voss again. No answer. Man's likely dead 30 years. Fool errand. February 22. The Whitlock line don't sit right on the old plat. Never did. Pa always said so and I never asked why. Mar 1. Told no one. Nothing to tell yet. If I'm wrong, it's an old man's foolishness and best kept quiet. He died 4 days after that last one, alone in the kitchen, with his heart giving out over a cup of coffee that was still half full when I found him. I sat there a long time with that notebook open on my knee, the lamp throwing a circle of yellow light that didn't reach the corners of the room, and I felt something turn over in my chest that wasn't grief exactly, though it had grief mixed in with it. It was the particular unease of finding out a dead man had a question he never got to finish asking. The Whitlock line don't sit right. Whitlock, same name as the boy who'd laughed at me over pie and coffee not 4 hours earlier. Voss. I turned that name over too. A name I'd never once heard spoken at the supper table or the Grange Hall. A name that belonged, near as I could tell, to nobody living in Cherry County anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about Duke out there in the dark, pawing at frozen ground he had no earthly business caring about, and a dead man's notebook that seemed, in its own quiet way, to agree with him. I started digging on a Wednesday, the 21st of March, before the sun had done more than gray up the eastern edge of the sky. I told myself I was just going to look. A man can tell himself all kinds of things at 5 in the morning with a shovel in his hand and frost still furring the grass. The ground in that north corner fought me hard that first day. Cherry County clay in March is about as forgiving as a bank examiner. Froze solid the first 8 inches down, and I broke a sweat inside a coat that was supposed to keep me warm, not the other way around. I got maybe a foot down before chores called me off, and Duke stood there the whole time, not 8 feet away, watching me with an attention I hadn't seen him give anything since my uncle's funeral, when he'd stood at the pasture fence and not touched his feed for 2 full days. Thursday I told Orville Fetch I had a fence post to reset when he asked what I was doing out there with a shovel before light. He allowed as how that seemed like a fool time of day for post setting, and I let him think what he wanted, because the truth would have sounded worse. Second day I got another foot, maybe a little more, sweat freezing in my collar, my hands blistering under gloves that had been my uncle's and were a size too big. Friday it snowed a little, just enough to make the digging miserable and slick, and I nearly quit. I stood in that hole up to my shins in mud and old frost, and asked myself out loud, which is a thing a man does more than he'd admit, whether I'd lost as much sense as everybody at the Grange Hall seemed to think Duke had. But I kept at it, because quitting felt like agreeing with all of them, and I wasn't ready to do that yet, not about the bull and not about myself. It was Saturday morning, the 24th, cold enough that my breath hung in front of my face like something solid, when the shovel finally struck metal instead of clay. It wasn't a soft sound. It was a flat, ringing clank that went up the handle into my arms and stopped my heart for half a second, the way a gunshot might. I knelt down right there in the mud, clawed at the dirt with my bare hands, because I didn't trust the shovel not to gouge whatever it was I'd found, and worked loose the corner of something rusted and rectangular, wedged tight about 2 feet under where Duke had worn the grass to nothing. I got it free just as the sky was turning the color of a fresh bruise over the windbreak, and I sat back on my heels and wiped the mud off the lid with my thumb, and there, stamped crooked into metal gone the color of dried blood, was a name I'd never once heard spoken in 17 years of living in that county. Elias Voss. I turned that name over so many times on the walk back to the house that morning, I about wore a groove in it, same as Duke had worn one in that pasture corner. I didn't know it then, but I'd carry that name around in my mouth for the better part of a week before anybody could tell me what it meant. I want you to understand I didn't rush into town with that box under my arm like some fella in a picture show. The lid was rusted shut tighter than a bank vault, and I was young, but I wasn't foolish. I knew whatever was inside had waited 60-some years already, and it could wait a few more days while I figured out who to ask. So I did what my uncle would have done. I went looking for somebody older than my questions. That turned out to be a widow woman named Mrs. Agatha Renfro, who kept the back room of the Cherry County Historical Society down in Valentine, a narrow building next to the feed store, with a bell over the door that rang thin and tired every time somebody came in. She was pushing 80 then, hands like dried corn husks, and she'd spent 40 years cataloging every scrap of county paper nobody else wanted. I brought her not the box itself, I still hadn't forced it open, afraid I'd damage whatever was inside, but just the name, scrawled on a scrap of feed sack paper. She didn't even have to think on it. She set down her tea, looked at me over the top of her spectacles and said, "Elias Voss surveyed half this county before the turn of the century, young man. Where'd you hear that name spoken?" I told her the truth, that I'd found it stamped on a box I dug up in my own north pasture, and her face did something I still remember plain as anything. A kind of stillness came over it, like a pond before weather. She told me Voss had been hired out of Omaha in 1897 to run the original boundary lines for the homestead families settling that stretch of Cherry County, my own great-grandfather's claim among them. And then she said something that stuck in me like a burr under a saddle blanket, that Voss's name disappeared from county record not long after, that there'd been talk, old talk, half forgotten even in her mother's time, about a boundary dispute that never made it to any courthouse, papers that were supposed to be filed and never were. "Whatever's in that box," she said, folding her hands like she was closing a book, "was buried before somebody could stop it from being buried." I drove home slower than I'd driven in, the box riding on the seat beside me, like a passenger I hadn't yet been introduced to, and Duke's fence corner sat waiting in my mind the whole way, patient as the bull himself. I set the box on the kitchen table that night, March 29th it must have been, because I remember the calendar my uncle kept nailed by the icebox still had that week marked for a vet visit that would never happen now. The kerosene lamp threw more shadow than light, and I sat there a good 10 minutes before I touched the lid again, like the thing might still bite. The hinges had rusted past use, so I worked a flathead screwdriver under the seam, and pried, slow, feeling the metal give in stages, first at one corner, then the other, until it came up with a sound, like a held breath finally let go. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth gone stiff and brown, were 3 items. The first was a set of deeds, the paper so dry it felt more like a dead leaf than anything a man once signed his name to, dated 1893 and 1895, pre-homestead in their language, describing boundary lines in chains and rods the way the old surveyors did, running the north line of my great-grandfather's claim a full half-mile further than the fence stood now. The second was a letter, and this one I read twice before I let myself believe it. Elias Voss's own hand, sworn and dated, stating plain that in the fall of 1901 he'd been approached by a man named Whitlock, the current rancher's grandfather. The letter said it outright, and asked to redraw the boundary survey to favor the Whitlock claim by 300 acres. Voss wrote that he'd refused to file the altered survey with the county, that he'd been paid regardless, and threatened besides, and that he was burying the true documents rather than see them destroyed, trusting whoever found them would know what to do. The third was the plat itself, hand-drawn, ink faded to the color of weak coffee, showing both lines side by side, the true one and the false one, like 2 roads that had once run together and split. I sat with those papers a long while, long enough the lamp burned low and I had to trim the wick. My hands weren't shaking, not yet, but there was a kind of ringing behind my ears, the way a barn goes quiet right before weather breaks. I thought about Whitlock's boy bringing over that spare fence stretcher back in April, how easy that family had always been with us, how his father tipped his hat to my uncle at the Grange Hall, same as anybody. And I thought about 300 acres of grass I'd watched Whitlock cattle graze my whole life, without ever once wondering why the fence sat where it did. Outside, past the window, past the dark shape of the barn, that north corner waited the same as it always had. I folded the letter back along its old crease, careful as I could, and understood I wasn't going to sleep much that night. Word got around the way word always got around in a county that size, which is to say, it got around before I'd even decided who I meant to tell. I've turned that over plenty of years since, wondering did the county clerk mention it to somebody at the co-op, or did I say more than I ought to at the feed store on a Thursday, buying wire I didn't need, just to have a reason to be in town. However it traveled, by the second week of June, Carl Whitlock's truck was sitting in my yard on a Saturday morning, engine still ticking from the drive, and he was leaning against the fender like a man who'd stopped by for coffee. He asked after the herd first. Asked about Duke, even. Said he'd heard the old bull had quit his pacing. Said that was good. A bull that age didn't need the aggravation. Then he got to it the way careful men do. Sideways, easy. Like he was talking about weather that hadn't decided yet whether to turn. He said he understood I'd come across some old papers. Said papers like that could be read a dozen ways, and lawyers could argue any of them, till a man's grandchildren were old themselves. Said his family had run cattle on that north ground 61 years, built water on it, strung fence on it, buried 2 good dogs on it, and there wasn't a jury in Cherry County that wanted to see that undone over ink gone the color of coffee. Then he said the part I remember word for word, because it was the first time in my life a grown man had offered me money to stay quiet. He said he could see his way to $800, cash, no bank involved, no note on paper, if I decided those old deeds were better left where I'd found them. He said it kind, almost fatherly, the same voice he'd used lending me that stretcher back in April. I thought about the note at Valentine State Bank, $2,400 still owed, and how $800 would have gone a long way toward it. I thought about how easy it would be to let a dead surveyor's papers stay dead. And I thought about my uncle's handwriting, gone jagged near the end of that notebook. A grown man, scared of a thing he couldn't prove, dying with it still unproved. I told Carl Whitlock I appreciated him driving all that way, and that I'd think on it. I didn't tell him I'd already decided. Man deserved that much courtesy, I figured, even if what I owed him wasn't courtesy at all. It was the truth, and I meant to see it filed where a truth belongs, in a courthouse, with a judge's signature under it, not folded quiet into a coffee can in my kitchen. I drove into Valentine on a Thursday, the 11th of July, 1962, with the strongbox papers wrapped in a flour sack on the truck seat beside me, like they might spill if I hit a pothole wrong. The Cherry County Courthouse sits on the square, with its limestone gone the color of weak coffee, and I remember the steps were hot enough that morning I could feel it through my boot soles. The clerk at the Register of Deeds was a woman named Alma Pruitt, and I set the papers on her counter one at a time, slow, the way you'd lay cards down in a game you weren't sure you were allowed to win. The 1897 survey first, the paper gone the color of a manila folder left in a window, Elias Voss's signature at the bottom in ink that had faded to rust but hadn't given up entirely. Then the sworn letter, folded in eighths so long it wanted to fold that way still. Then the plat, hand-drawn, the lines ruled with a straight edge that had left a groove in the paper you could feel with your thumbnail. Her hands started shaking on the second document. I watched it happen. She'd been reading fast, the way clerks read, and then she slowed down, and then she stopped reading altogether, and just looked at the seal in the corner, the notary stamp, Cherry County, 1897, still sharp enough you could make out the eagle's wing, and she said she needed to make a phone call. They brought in Judge Harlan Meese from his chambers upstairs, a man I'd only ever seen from a distance at the co-op, and he didn't sit down right away. He stood over that counter with his glasses pushed up on his forehead and read the field notes, line by line, comparing the meets and bounds against a ledger book Alma pulled off a shelf that hadn't been opened, from the dust on it, since Eisenhower was inaugurated. He kept saying the surveyor's name out loud, quiet, like he was trying to place it. Voss. Elias Voss. He asked me twice where I'd found the box, and I told him twice. The north pasture, 2 feet down, the fence corner my bull wouldn't leave alone. Nobody in that room said anything for a long stretch after that. Alma had her hand pressed flat on the counter, like she needed something solid under it. The judge held the plat up to the window light, turning it slow, checking the ruled lines against the recorded 1901 resurvey he'd sent a boy running to fetch from the vault. He set both papers down, side by side. "These boundary lines," he said, "don't match." That was the whole of it, right there. 2 words a county judge said to an empty room, full of dust and old paper, and 61 years came apart, like wet rope. He didn't bang a gavel. There wasn't one to bang. He just told Alma to start the paperwork for a boundary correction, and told me to come back Thursday with whatever kin I could produce to sign as witness, which wasn't much of anybody, just me and a lawyer the bank recommended who did it for the price of a case of canned peaches, near as I could tell. It took the better part of that summer to make it official. A survey crew came out in June, drove their stakes exactly where Elias Voss had drawn them 65 years before, and I watched the tape stretch out across ground I'd walked 1,000 times not knowing it was mine. By the end of July, the deed was recorded clean, 300 acres back on the coal side of the ledger, and the banknote didn't look nearly so heavy once the grazing numbers changed. Duke never went back to that corner. Not once. I watched him that whole next fall, out of habit more than worry, and he'd graze right past it like it was any other stretch of fence. Whatever had been pulling at him was settled, I suppose. Same as it was settled in me. I put him out on the easy pasture closest to the house after that. Let him get fat and lazy and useless in the way an old bull's earned the right to be. He lived 4 more years on that ground, mean as ever about his feed but gentle about everything else, and I never once regretted a bag of oats I gave him. The Whitlock boy, grown man by then, older than me by a couple years, I ran into him at the feed store that August, both of us waiting on the same order of fence wire, of all things. He didn't say much, just gave me a nod, the kind you give a man you've decided you're not going to feud with, and asked how the herd was wintering, like nothing had ever passed between our families at all. I gave him the same nod back. There wasn't any use in more than that. His father lost the grazing, not him, and there's no sense making a young man carry a debt that isn't his to pay, though I noticed he never did offer to loan me equipment again, and I never asked. The county paper ran 2 lines about it, tucked back by the grain prices, calling it a boundary correction, like it was nothing more than a surveyor's error from another century finally caught up with itself. Maybe that's all it was. To everyone but the 2 families it moved dirt for. So that's where I'm standing now. Boots in the same clay I dug up 60 years back, except there's grass over it, thick as a rug, and a piece of granite, the county set here in '94, when they finally got around to marking the corner proper. Doesn't say much on it. It's the line and a date and the word restored, like the land had been sick and got well again. I suppose in a way it had. Duke's long gone, of course. Lived 11 more years after that summer, fat and lazy in the easy pasture down by the creek, and I swear he never so much as glanced at this corner again once the papers were filed. Like whatever had been gnawing at him was settled, same as it settled in me. I buried him under the cottonwood behind the barn, dug that hole myself too, though it didn't take 4 mornings. Grief moves faster than justice does, I've found, in either direction. I think about that old bull most when I see some young fellow getting talked down to at the sale barn, or the bank, some grown man calling him son, in that voice that means, boy who doesn't know anything. I want to tell them what I'm telling you now, that the things worth finding are rarely where anybody's looking, and the ones who see them first are usually the ones nobody thought to ask. A senile animal pawing dirt. A dead man's cramped handwriting in a ledger nobody opened. A patient kid with a shovel and 4 cold mornings to spare. That's not luck. That's just paying attention to what everyone else has decided isn't worth their time. I'm an old man now, older than my uncle ever got to be, and I've buried more on this place than I've dug up, but I never forgot that some of what's buried is waiting on you, not against you. Every family's got ground like that, I'd wager. A trunk in a cellar, a box of letters nobody's read since the war. A story an uncle started telling and never finished. You don't have to be smart to find it. You just have to be the one who didn't walk past it. So if you've got a place like this, an attic, a barn loft, a drawer that sticks, go open it. And if you've got a story of your own, something your family dug up or should have, put it down in the comments below. I'd like to hear it. Been telling mine long enough. And if this one kept you company a while, stay close. There's always more buried out here than folks let on.